Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy again from WCA Biology B, and we are actually on our last lesson. Well, not really the last lesson, but the last lesson of new content, anyways, for the unit on biological evolution evidence. And since this Unit 8, is the last unit of the school year, this is basically your last lesson of new content for the school year. Of course, you still have the apply section. You've got to do some review and take a test and all that fun stuff. But this is going to be kind of the last new stuff. A little hair thing going on there. All right, so our keywords are just a few. We have amino acids, tetrapod, and vertebrate embryo. And really, this is a review lesson. Don't forget about the link below my picture on the Student Hub page here on my website, which you will find a link to the reviews kind of study guide that goes along with this. It's you can make your own as well. It's not that hard, but we're going to go through kind of some of the main ideas from this lesson. So essentially, there are kind of some pieces of evidence to support that evolution's happening. Now remember that we are specifically talking about evolution here, not natural selection. So evolution is the premise that living things have changed over time, that today living things are different than they were in the past, and that those changes have occurred through multiple mechanisms, right? So we have our mechanism of natural selection is one way in which change happens, that there are traits, which we call adaptations, that are favorable, that are favorable in certain environments, that then favor those organisms that possess those traits for selection. They get to survive, pass on their genes to the next generation, and then therefore that trait is more predominant in the next and subsequent generations, right? That's natural selection. So that's one of the mechanisms behind evolution. Another mechanism behind evolution or change over time is that we see genetic drift plays a role. Sometimes just random accidents that cause some organisms to go extinct and others to stay alive, and those random accidents can drive change over time. But probably the most kind of universal and just, I guess, like the most reliable mechanism is that of natural selection, because that's been happening throughout history. So is genetic drift, but genetic drift is just kind of random chance here and there, whereas evolution by natural selection is happening all the time. So what pieces of evidence do we have? We have comparative anatomy, we have embryology, we have the fossil record, and we have DNA. So those are some pieces of evidence that help to support the fact that evolution is occurring. So let's kind of review those. We've talked about them before. We're going to review them. A couple other premises behind evolution. All living things on Earth, including animals, plants, and microbes, share a common ancestry. So think of that tree of life, that we all have the same trunk of the tree. Living things have adapted and changed over time for specific discoverable reasons. There's that natural selection piece, and that there's still a great deal to learn about the process of evolution. So let's first look at our first piece of evidence, and that is comparative anatomy. So we are going to look at the anatomy of different animals in this case. We're going to compare them and see similarities. So we have the dolphin, the human, man, come on, men and women. So horse, bat, and we see the different bone structures. Now, outwardly, they look very different. The flipper of a dolphin, the arm of a human, the leg of a horse, the wing of a bat. But internally, they have a lot of similarities. They actually have the same bones in the same order. They're slightly different in shape, but they all occur and in the same locations, right? We can kind of see those here. Those carpals and metacarpals and stuff, which are found in all of them, and that kind of stuff. So this is that whole idea behind homologous structures that we talked about in the previous lesson. These are all homologous to each other. They have the same actual structure to them, even though they don't have the same function. Dolphins use their flippers to swim. We use our arms to carry things and use them to try to manipulate tools. Horses use their legs to run, and bats use their wings to fly. But we can compare the anatomy of different animals And we can see how they all have the same kind of structure, and that structure is determined by genetics. So we know that has to be something that's programmed into their DNA. We also have embryology, that when we look at embryos of animals, that those embryos all have a similar process of development. For example, humans' embryos go through a stage during which tails and gills are formed, suggesting that at some point, human beings and fish evolved from a common ancestor. Keep in mind that we're not saying that human beings evolved from fish. That is not true. What we're saying is if you go back far enough in time in the tree of life, that they shared a common ancestor. This means that the genes that control the early development of these embryos were likely inherited from a common ancestor. All right, wonderful. So then we look at fossil evidence. We can't see everything that happened in the past, but we do have one window into the past, and that is looking, well, I should say we actually have kind of two windows. We have the fossil window, we also have the DNA window, if you will. But one window that we can look at through into the past is through fossils. So we can determine when and where different groups of organisms lived based on the fossils that we have. Remember, the fossil record is incomplete. So we don't have a complete picture of what the past looked like, but we have a complete enough picture of enough organisms to get a good gist of what happened. Okay, so we can look here, for example, of some history of primates, hominids, the southern ape, handyman, upright man, human. This is showing through time and also compared to brain size. So his brain size has increased through time from about 4 million years ago to present day, and we see a change in the basically the cranial size of these different primates to show us that change is indeed occurring through time. Um, Again, we can see also how life has changed in general. So at the beginning of the Cambrian period, we call this period the Cambrian Explosion. And that took place here about 540 million years ago when the abundance of organisms on Earth really just rapidly changed. So we went from having very little diversity to a plethora of diversity in a very short period of time, which is why that is known as the Cambrian Explosion. And this is also fossil evidence kind of showing us what the past has been like. And then finally, we can look within ourselves for evidence. We can look inside of ourselves and look at the DNA, which is in the nucleus of all multicellular organisms, all eukaryotic celled organisms, whether single celled or multicellular, and even within all bacteria, they have DNA. Not in their nuclei, but it's still there. So all living things have the same 20 amino acids. So that's kind of weird. Even the little tiny bacteria that makes me sick and I have the same 20 amino acids that code for all the proteins and stuff that are produced in our bodies. And we have the same A, T, C's, and G's that make up our DNA. So simply the structure of DNA and the process through which proteins are made is evidence itself that we all have something in common, right? But not only that, but we can actually look at certain proteins and we can look at how similar those proteins are. For example, humans and chimpanzees both produce a protein named hemoglobin, which we can see here. Hemoglobin is a beautiful protein that carries oxygen. It is found on red blood cells. It's found on these guys here. And it carries oxygen and it allows us to transport oxygen to our cells so we can live and we can do cellular respiration. And thank you so much, hemoglobin. It's very, very important. So scientists can actually look at the sequence of amino acids that actually codes for hemoglobin. You can compare them. Like remember that a protein is made up of a whole bunch of amino acids that strung together and folded up to make the protein. And we can compare chimpanzees and human beings amino acid sequence side by side. Humans and chimpanzees produce nearly identical amino acid sequences for hemoglobin. And this tells us that we share a very recent common ancestor, much more recent than any other species, living species of animal on Earth today. Okay, so we can compare fossil DNA of other non-living things. We can actually dig up like old bones and stuff of, old human ancestors. If they have some tissue to be able to analyze them, maybe they've been frozen in the ice in Siberia or something, they can actually extract and analyze the DNA. Isn't that kind of gross? And they can determine how close in relationship they are to us as well. They can kind of, compare the amino acid sequences of specific proteins and really look at how close they relate to modern day humans, which I think is pretty darn cool. All right, so there are our four kind of major pieces of evidence supporting evolution. Supports change over time. Remember, the mechanism of evolution is natural selection, primarily, right? We also have genetic drift, which can cause short term change in allele frequency from one generation to another. It can be permanent depending on how severe that change actually is, but oftentimes with genetic drift, population will eventually rebound. But that's everything, guys. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, it has been a pleasure this school year, and good luck, everyone, on your final test in biology. Talk to y'all later. Bye bye.